So you've probably heard of this Bidenflation. People are saying that Joe Biden is, I don't know, causing inflation by pulling money out of his pants, throwing it everywhere. There's obviously no reason why he's doing anything. He just hates the country and is causing inflation. Of course, that's not really true. Most Americans, whenever they hear of economic policy, tend to think of the US as the only country in the world, maybe with the exception of China or the EU. But of course, the US deals with a lot of countries, and inflation, even though it tends to be something that deals with American money, actually is not only an American problem. So inflation is occurring actually around the world right now. So if it was just Bidenflation, we'd probably expect, uh, you know, it not to be occurring in other countries. However, as you'll see, it is occurring in other countries. So let's look at Martin Wolf's uh, op-ed. I guess it's not an op-ed, but his opinion. Fed policy must adjust for inflation. Of course, Fed referring to the Federal Reserve. Let's take a look here. So this is my Financial Times account, of course. Fed policy must adjust for inflation. Even if the price rises we are seeing could be transitory, they risk becoming permanent. And of course, you have this interesting graphic of a blimp that is the US dollar. It seems like everyone's scared of it for some reason. I don't understand why. Inflation isn't a good thing, but some inflation is. And inflation really doesn't seem to be that high, but we'll get to that later. Okay, so I'm actually not going to cover his argument. I agree with it. It doesn't seem to me that it's particularly controversial even. But I want to more show the arguments that he uses, the data that he uses to back up his argument. So let's look at the first graph here. Headline and core prices are rising, especially in the US. So this actually gives us a lot about the nature of inflation. So if we look at headline and core prices, so I have a new green screen, a newfangled green screen that I'm trying to work out, and that's not right. Headline and core prices, okay, let's just make that a circle, are rising. So what is a headline price and what is a core price? So first, actually, let's move back. Every single country is seeing some form of inflation. This is the US's graph, but every country is seeing some form of inflation, which makes sense, of course. Inflation tends to occur throughout, through economic activity. So inflation also tends to be targeted at around 2% by the Fed. So it being at 6% is kind of bad, but it's not that upsetting. So here with January 2020 being the baseline, you can even see that the US underwent deflation, which by the way is more serious than inflation. Low deflation is even bad. You can look at like Japan for an example of that. So you're going through deflation at the beginning, and then we're seeing a fairly high inflation afterwards. So it is true that the steep inflation curve could be worrying to some, but the other issue is that we started actually lower than many other countries did. However, we are ending up higher, so that is bad. Okay, so headline prices, core prices. Headline means it includes food and energy. So we don't really, or we do use a CPI for a variety of different things. We use it for Social Security, COLA adjustments. We use it for a lot of things. But the core price is more important for the Federal Reserve because it excludes volatile commodities like food and energy. So it includes things like clothing, medical care, education, these things that increase generally, but it excludes food and energy. So although you can feel headline prices more, and you can even see in most countries, headline and core are a bit closer than they are here. Headline is what we feel the most of. But it also means that core inflation isn't really affecting, or it's affecting the headline price, but there's something else doing that. And what is that? Well, some people say it's the supply line. Some people say it's something else. But it seems to me that it could be a few things. I'm going to say it primarily is the supply chain crisis, which could be good because right now, in fact, we are seeing the supply chain crisis begin to dissipate, which is good for Joe Biden and good for the country, of course, but specifically for Joe Biden politically. So a few people, he mentions a few people are upset about the fiscal stimulus proposed by President Biden. But what's more important to me actually is this graph. This is perhaps the most important graph here because it shows what investors believe about the stock market. About the inflation expectations. So you may have heard actually that inflationary expectations are more important than the increase in the price level when it comes to inflation. I would probably say that because the expectation of inflation actually changes people's buying habits more than inflation itself. And as we're seeing, a lot of stores and retail corporations are beginning to actually change prices because not because they need to due to inflation, but because people think inflation is happening, so they're able to change prices and blame it on inflation. So inflationary expectations are actually fairly important here. If we look at the graph, again, we have we have conventional bonds, which are here, and TIPS. TIPS are called inflation protected bonds are called TIPS, which are Treasury inflation protected securities. And TIPS, I think, are negative right now. They haven't been negative in a while, but they are negative right now, which means that if you know how bonds work, yield to maturity. That means that the yield is negative because TIPS. So the way a bond works is that a bond is both the coupon and at the end you have the par value. So you get paid the coupon every so often, and then you get paid the par value at the very end. So coupons tend to be how interest is paid. So for TIPS, actually, if I have $100 bond, right, or I pay $100 for a bond, I expect to get the $100 at the end of the par value, but I expect to get the interest at the coupon. However, with TIPS, because it's inflation protected, you actually get an increase in your coupon and an increase in your par by the amount of inflation. So if it's a 6% inflation, as it was in October, you get a 6% increase. So in fact, you're not really making negative 1% yield, you're making 5% yield, which is why through something that's not that important, but it's called parity, that's a bond parity, I forget the name, TIPS plus inflation. So TIPS, okay, wrong circle. TIPS plus inflation should equal the conventional. And because otherwise, why would you get TIPS? Or why would you get conventional? If you can buy TIPS and get a higher return, you'd buy TIPS. And if you could buy conventional and get a higher return, you'd buy conventional. So the difference between them should be what people expect inflation to be. As you can see, TIPS have fallen quite a bit and conventional has risen quite a bit. So actually, inflation expectations are increasing right now. However, it's important to note that if we look at the number actually here, the inflation expectation is around 3%, which is fairly important because if it was higher, like 6%, we'd probably say people expect this to go on for much longer, but they don't. They don't expect it to go on for longer. Now, to be clear, Wolf here actually mentions something different. He says worriers may feel vindicated, but I think he does mention that core inflation rates are better in the Eurozone and the UK because, in other countries, they don't really see it to be as big of an issue. So here is a mention of the U.S. labor market. Just briefly, labor market does not include the LFPR, labor force participation rate. So take this with a grain of salt. But basically, the employment rate has basically become normal, while the employment rate and unemployment rate have basically become normal. So we are in a recovery, and we're probably going to get back to normal soon, but inflation is still an issue. So, he mentions inflation expectations have risen by around a percentage point. Okay. But that special factors, which are factors that are not part of core inflation, are probably increasing inflation. So you can even see here, gas, coal, and electricity prices have increased over the past year. And these are futures. I don't know too much about the future market, especially as it relates to gas, but gas futures being higher means that people think gas prices are going to increase. However, you can even see that gas prices seem to be decreasing because gas futures are decreasing. So that is something important to note. So people expect the gas crisis to dissipate in the next, or not dissipate, but become better in the next few months. So that's what the markets are telling us right now. Moving on past gas futures, which I wish I could cover more because they're pretty important, but I don't know too much about them, and I don't cover things I don't know about. This is important. Levels of gas in European storage are lower. This is actually having a major impact on foreign policy, but I'm not going to cover that now. Let's move on because it's not the U.S. and everything that's not the U.S. doesn't matter. So then the final thing is that consumption of durable goods soared after the COVID crisis. So this is huge because you can see, in fact, that real consumption expenditure, which is real means taking out inflation, and personal consumption is one of the major drivers of the economy. Investment, government spending, and net exports being the other major sectors. But consumption is important because you can see that it's increasing quite a bit. So services haven't even reached, and you can see here, services haven't reached their pre-COVID levels. We are still at circling wrong here. We're still at another wrong circle. We're still at probably around 90 something, but services here were at 100. But now we're seeing a massive increase in good consumption, which is itself fueling the rise in inflation. So we generally wouldn't do inflation with I because that can mean investment, but it's increasing the rate of inflation, which I think tends to be R in economics. So this is big because it kind of means that our economy is doing well due to the increased consumption of goods. However, we still have to get in a place where services, which tend to be how small businesses function, where services have picked up as well. So basically, Wolf's general argument is that the Fed should respond to inflation and that inflation is currently transitory, but it doesn't have to be transitory. It could be permanent. And that is scary for policymakers because inflation is right now the number one, maybe not the number one, but one of the major criticisms of the Biden administration and one of the major criticisms of the Fed, because the Fed's mandate is decrease inflation or keep inflation targeted to 2%, rather. But inflation seems to be right now as high as 6%, of course. That's the highest it's been. I kind of disagree with Wolf a bit here. I kind of see 6% as the highest inflation will go. I don't see it as going particularly higher. And in fact, investors agree with me. Now, to be clear, as I think another Financial Times piece mentioned in the past, bond markets are okay at predicting inflation, but they can be wrong. But that being said, I really, really have faith. I don't have faith, of course, but I believe that the bond market tends to be a good predictor of inflation, which means to me that you're probably going to see around a 3% increase in inflation, and that's it. So as an average, and of course Wolf decries this in the piece, but as an average, inflation targeting will probably be fine. It'll probably reach 3%. It'd be lowered by that much. The Fed may continue to make mistakes, but as of right now, I think the Fed is doing well in terms of its response to the inflation crisis, which isn't really a crisis, but people are saying it's a crisis, so let's say it's a crisis. Finally, Jerome Powell was not reconfirmed, but he was renominated recently. So we are still going to be paying attention to that. So if you want to hear more about inflation, an actual sober take on inflation without saying inflation is great, without saying inflation is terrible, and without blaming it on Joe Biden, keep in contact with In Progress with Raymond Perez. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment, etc. If you're a gold bug or someone who thinks that I'm wrong on inflation, please comment. I love arguing with people on inflation because a lot of people just simply don't understand it. And they have bad arguments. So like, comment, subscribe for more, and I will see you next time.